All right, well, thanks everybody for having me again. It's good to be with you all. I'm quickly coming to enjoy my every fourth Thursday evening with you guys. So I think this is, the fourth time I've been here. If there's anybody new here that I haven't met before, I'm Kenny Sholes. I live here in Poolesville. I grew up here in town, graduated from Poolesville High School in 2002, and then went off to West Point and the Army, and been kind of all over the place, and then moved back here with my wife and two kids about 3 or 4 years ago now. I live 5 doors down from my parents where I grew up, which is, an interesting and wonderful thing for the most part. And, I'm excited to be back in town. And one of the things that I've been kind of interested in since I was little is old houses around the ag reserve. And so about 2 years ago, I started kind of on this very random and informal effort to go out and to start kind of cataloging some of the old homes around the ag reserve and sharing them with others. And it's kind of picked up from there. I continue 2 years later to be interested in it and feel kind of inspired and interested in it. And it's led to a bunch of talks. It's led to a bunch of articles. And so it's been a lot of fun. And I can tell that, people around here actually have a lot of interest in local history, which is exciting. It's exciting when you see other people get excited about it. So in all of my prior talks, I've talked specifically about old homes. And tonight I want to do something a little bit different. There's still plenty of homes to talk about. I'm not running out of them yet. But I wanted to focus on a family and kind of a storyline that I've been kind of interested in for a long time. And I've been kind of slowly learning more and more about it. And there's still plenty to learn. And so tonight will be more focused on kind of a couple of generations of the same family, specifically centered around one person, this individual, Nathan White. And we'll talk about that. And I think just by going through and kind of talking about his experience and relationships in his own family, it'll give you a good sense of different things that are taking place kind of around the ag reserve through the kind of early 1800s through the mid to late 1800s. And my general kind of thesis here, just to make it as academic as possible, and obviously this is not a view that I'm the only one that holds, but I think generally speaking, when we go back and we look at specific individuals and decisions they made and the way that they interacted with other people, we quickly kind of learned that while this world that is crazy and seemingly out of control and changing by the day, while that is occurring, at the same time, we as humans really are not changing that much in terms of what drives us, what concerns us, what motivates us to achieve goals, what we hope for, what we're scared of, that type of thing. And I think hopefully I can kind of prove that through some of the kind of historic evidence around this individual and this family. So this is a chart that I've actually shown multiple times before. And I like it because what kind of general context and scene setting here is that the White family and the Chiswell families have been around these parts for a long time, since at least probably the last half of the 1700s, if not earlier. And these two families, as you can see from this family tree, there's a lot of intermarriage here. There's a lot of marrying of cousins. There's a lot of kind of, cousins marrying cousins, and which, was common back then in rural times, so no judgment. But I've always been kind of just fascinated by these two families because ultimately I can link almost every historic home in the ag reserve back to these families in one manner or another, because they are so intertwined in kind of the historic fabric of this place. And where I wanted to focus tonight is right here. So Inverness is a home that I think it's a fairly well-known home for those who kind of know of old homes in this area. It's out by Dickerson. It's, you know, very close to like the blinking stoplight out there in Dickerson. I'm sure most people kind of know that as a landmark. And that home, just thought to have been built around 1818, was inhabited by members of the White family for a long time, from when it was built until I believe the mid 1900s, when it was sold out of the family. And I've always been fascinated with this home. This is actually one of the few homes I've never been to. I've never seen inside it. I've actually never really even been up that close to it. So I think part of the kind of fascination for me is just there's a certain kind of mystery and unknown to it. But also I think that there's some interesting history here, and there's a lot of historic evidence and kind of artifacts that we have to point to kind of tell an interesting story about this family. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to do to a certain extent tonight. Okay, so these are kind of, if we think of tonight as a, you know, a theater production, these are kind of the main acts of, or the main actors in this work. So at the upper left, we have Benjamin White and his wife, Rebecca. And they are the individuals who initially, I'm not sure that they actually built Inverness, but they moved into it relatively soon after it was built. They had multiple children, 4 or 5, but one of their sons was Nathan Smith White, who you see there in the center on the left. He's also the young man in the center on the right with his, at that point, new bride, Fredericka Mackey White. And then in the lower right, you see Fredericka and Nathan's 2 children, Benjamin Smith White and Rebecca Holmes White. And so I'm going to talk about these individuals. I'm going to kind of focus on Nathan Smith White here in the middle because there's a lot of things around him. I think he lived a pretty interesting life, and it tells us a lot about that time period. But I'd also say, like, just keep in mind that I'm essentially boiling down into, you know, 40 minutes or so the full kind of life timeline of this individual. I don't mean offense by that. Of course, they lived richer lives than what I'm going to present. I'm simply cherry picking some highlights and some interesting components of this individual's life and his links to his family through this time. All right, so to start and to kind of set the scene here, here's Inverness. This is the home out in Dickerson. You can see, you know, built by an individual by the name Charles Wilson. He was a pretty, I believe, a builder of some prominent homes in the area back in this time frame. So I think his hands were involved in building of Annington, which is out by White's Ferry. I think he also even played a role at East Oaks, which was built in the 1820s. And then he played a role here in leading the build of Inverness. And I think one of the mysteries that I'm not sure of is whether the house actually was built in 1818 or a little bit later. And I can show you why in a bit through letters. I've seen different things indicating that the White family actually didn't move in here until 1825. I also see direct quotes in letters from members of the White family who talk about moving into the big brick house, and that's as late as 1836. So still a little bit of mystery here to me about when this home was actually finished and when people began to live in it. But at the end of the day, you know, we're talking early 1800s, quite a grand home, fairly standard federal style build. Just to kind of pull out a little bit, so this is the map. This is known as the Martinet and Bond map. This is from 1865, and that red box is where this home is located. So you look in kind of the bottom center, you see Poolesville, where I am, probably where most of you are. You can see that up there. And then if we look at the map from 1879, we've got Poolesville kind of center bottom again, and then the home up to the right. That's because this 1869 map is kind of oriented in a weird, it's not oriented north-south, which makes it kind of odd. And then this map from the 1970s, which, you know, I think has kind of the roads as laid out as most of us would recognize and drive today, with with Inverness up there at the top, Poolesville kind of in the middle. And you can see kind of right in front of that red box is that sharp turn. That's where the, the blinking light is. All right, so Nathan White. So we know that he's born in 1817, somewhere in the Ag Reserve. I'm not completely sure I know where. I think, I believe there's potentially some kind of log home or less permanent structure in the area of where Inverness currently stands. And then that may be where he was born, but I'm not sure of that. And we'll talk about this, but in 1833, he leaves the Dickerson area and goes off and starts at Princeton, which is a pretty unique jump, I think. I haven't seen a whole lot of other stories like that from the Ag Reserve at that period of time. Graduates from Princeton, goes on to Yale Law School, very impressive. And he starts up a law firm that runs in Charlestown, West Virginia. Early 1840s, he has children, and then in the late 1800s, he dies in Charlestown, West Virginia. He's buried there with his wife and his children at the Zion Episcopal Church in downtown Charlestown. So that's a very quick overview, but what I wanted to do was kind of dive in just to kind of show some interesting facets of this individual's life and the White family. So I kind of broke this into two parts, and basically what happened here is about a year and a half ago, I started wondering to myself whether there was anybody from the Ag Reserve who fought in the Civil War and was killed in battle. And so I started, I don't think Glenn's on here, but Glenn Wallace has done a ton of work mapping Monocacy Cemetery as well as a bunch of other local cemeteries. And I started kind of using a lot of the work that he had done to search through local graveyards to see if I could find any males who died between 1861 and 1865 when the war started. And then when I found them, I would kind of dig in to see if I could find anything indicating that they had actually been killed while serving in battle. And I didn't find anybody. And I don't actually know that there is. I know that there were individuals that were killed in Poolesville during the Civil War. I know there were some that died here after fighting at Ball's Bluff or were sick, or I know there was a small skirmish at one point that killed 2 or 3. But those individuals were not from Poolesville or from the Ag Reserve. They were from units out of the Northeast, largely out of Massachusetts. So as I expanded my search, I came across an individual who had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. And as I started to kind of line back up the family tree chart, I landed on Nathan White, who I'm focused on kind of tonight. And as I continued to kind of dig in, what happened was I figured out that there happened to be a number of letters and diaries that had just, I'm not really sure why, but they had been preserved and saved. And they ended up at a bunch of different places. So the Virginia History Museum had some, the Duke University Library had some, which is still confusing as to how they ended up there, because I've seen no linkage to North Carolina or Duke in any of this. Yale and Princeton both had some records. There was even some records at a high school down in Alexandria, which I'll talk about. But anyway, as I dug into this story with interest, what was fascinating was normally when you dig into this stuff, you run into dead ends pretty quickly. And here it felt like I was seeing real life kind of things from the past that were really painting a picture of who these people were. So the 1830s, this first set is, we have a series of letters. I have basically 200 pages of what you see here on the screen. This is like a screenshot of it, of letters all addressed to Nathan White when he's at Princeton and a little bit after. So the letters are mostly from 1833 to 1837 when he graduated, but there are some into the 1840s. The letters, as you can see here, I mean, like I said, I've got 200 pages of it. It takes, and it's not unclear on the page because it's on a slide or because it's small to you. This is how it looks on this screen, is exactly how it looks in my possession. So it takes a long time to read through these pages and decipher what they're saying. So I've tried to do some of that legwork for you all. It's going to take me a long time to get through all of these letters. But this one, believe it or not, like the handwriting here is actually very, very good. This is actually an easier one to read. But so this is from Nathan's father, and he's writing, and this is Benjamin White, the individual who, you know, may or may not have built Inverness. And he's this, you know, kind of very successful farmer, but he's writing to his son, who's now a freshman at college. And he's basically, in all of his letters, he's very kind of to the point, a little bit stern, very kind of pragmatic, and always offering kind of some different lessons and advice to his son. And he's always, in all of the letters, he's concerned with a couple of like specific things. One is money. He's very, very concerned with how his son's spending the money, how he's watching it. Here, he's giving him advice about how to track where he's spending it. He writes to his son all the time about crops, which makes sense, but the crops are never good. I think I've got, you know, in the 7 or 8 years of span of letters that I have from this father to this son, every time he writes, it's the weather's terrible, the crops are doing poorly, I don't know how we're going to make it, it's never going to work, you know. So he's very pessimistic, but clearly, you know, they live in this big grand house, and so there's an interesting kind of dichotomy between those two things. And then the third thing is he's always talking to him about kind of the general qualities of what make just a good human, right? He's talking about being honest. He's talking about, you can see here, being respectful, paying attention, and basically making this point over and over again that you'll get ahead in life just by kind of being respectful of others. And so, you know, I think it's interesting advice, obviously very much still relevant. And I just kind of love that, you know, you can imagine a father today kind of saying something relatively similar to, you know, their son going off to college for the first time. And then here in January of 1835, we have Nathan's brother, younger brother, writing to Nathan. And his younger brother at this point, I believe, is 13 or 14. And he's telling him about how they've just had this huge snowfall and the snow is up to their knees. And he says they always describe the local area as, quote, the neighborhood. And that's like, that entails like all of, from what I can tell, like all of Dickerson, all of Barnesville, all of even Poolesville is just the neighborhood. But they always talk about other people in the neighborhood and the goings on in the neighborhood, and the latest weddings in the neighborhood. Here he's talking about all these other individuals that appear to be around his age. And he says they are sleighing about, which, you know, the spelling there kind of threw me off from it, but then I realized he's literally talking about them in a sleigh behind horses being pulled around. And he's kind of disappointed because they have not shown up at their house yet to let him join in on the fun, but he's hopeful that that's going to take place soon. So I just thought that was funny. And in some ways, you know, you could maybe not on sleigh, but you could imagine a similar scenario taking place today if it was to snow out. College is expensive. That has certainly not changed. And I'll show you actually how expensive it was in the 1830s in a minute. But this letter gives us a really interesting detail about something that I hadn't seen before. You know, I mentioned that it was odd to see kind of a young man from the area head straight off to Princeton from, you know, pretty rural farmland in the 1830s. And it looks like basically the deal that Nathan, who was the oldest son, which is probably a big part of the reason why he was able to do this, he made this deal with his father, where his father basically gave him his inheritance well before his father died. Obviously, he gave it to him to pay for college, to go off to Princeton. And so that's how they were able to afford it. And there's letters from, well, I don't know that there's letters from Nathan, but I can tell in the responses that he's receiving from his brothers and sisters that he feels a certain level of kind of guilt about this, right? And this is kind of a response to that from his brother, basically saying like, look, we understand that you got this really good deal from dad. We're cool with it. It's all right. You know, we're all going to be happy when you're kind of one of the best lawyers in the area. So just, you know, do your thing up there, take care of business, study hard, and you know, we're all proud of you. And what I think is cool about this is, one, I mean, it's kind of just nice to see that, but also Nathan does become quite a prominent lawyer in this area later on down the road. So he does kind of hold up that end of the bargain. He goes off and obviously goes to Yale Law School and has this very successful practice. So just kind of an interesting dialogue and back and forth here. Okay, so one of the more kind of obviously heavy issues here is so Inverness has slave quarters behind it. I think there's no question that enslaved labor was used at Inverness. I'm almost positive by the whites at that location. We know that the white family, when it came time for the Civil War, very much was some of the leaders in the area of kind of promoting joining the Confederacy. And in fact, Elijah White, who White's Ferry is named after, led a group of they were nicknamed the Comanches, but they were a lot of boys from Poolesville and from the surrounding area who crossed the river and fought for the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. And so one of the things that I've really been kind of looking for in these letters is getting a sense of how do families talk about that issue at that time, right? I mean, this is, 1836, right? So we still have another 14, 15 years before the Civil War even starts. And to be honest with you, I just haven't found much discussion about it. It just doesn't appear to be something that's really part of this back and forth conversation, which again, doesn't mean it wasn't happening. I'm not at all kind of defending that. I just thought it was an interesting thing. Here, I did take note though, and you can kind of see the word abolition there in the letter, right in the middle towards the bottom. But it's kind of a back and forth between Nathan and his brother, and his brother, kind of lightly brings up politics. And says that there's a great deal of excitement in the House about abolition. Now, based on earlier context, when he says the House, I actually think he's referring to the House as in Congress, not the House as in the White family. But I don't know. I can't prove that, and I'm just not sure. And then he says, "But we see the men from the South stand firm," and it's fascinating because they always talk about, even the father in some of his letters, he talks about Southern men as if they are distinct from them, right? They don't view themselves in these letters as Southern men, which I think is kind of fascinating. But as we'll see, when the Civil War starts, they very much are on the side of the South. So just, I think it's just interesting to see that these issues at the time are not, they're not so clear cut. It's kind of just this fascinating kind of conversation that's taking place at that time. This one, so I threw this one in there just because I just think it's cool. So this is later in 1836, and it's his sister writing to Nathan, and she's talking about going up to the mountain, which she's referring to Sugarloaf Mountain on Easter with her friends to celebrate the holiday. And I just like thinking about teenagers in the 1830s going up to Sugarloaf to celebrate Easter. I mean, I think you can still, I think last I checked, you could still do like sunrise service at St. Mary's on Sugarloaf Mountain for Easter. So this is like something that's been happening for almost 200 years now. I just think it's interesting to think about. And also I'm very curious, like what did Sugarloaf Mountain even look like? I'm clear there was not trails or anything then. So it's fascinating to think about them kind of climbing to the top and being up there. And then here's that report card I mentioned. And it's funny, above this, there's actually a official text from Princeton, and it's basically explaining that they send these report cards back to the parents because they had so many parents bugging them and asking them for their children's grades because their children were not showing them to them, which I think is funny. It's like the same reason that, MCPS sends home the report cards in the mail. It's like that has certainly not changed. You can see here, it looks like Nathan behavioral wise is good. Industry, I guess, which is, how hard he's working is good. His scholarships at a mid-level B. So I don't know what his father thought about that. But what I think is really fascinating is at the bottom, the tuition fees. You can see it looks like the tuition for the winter session at Princeton was $96. So one of the things that I do outside of my day job is help high school students navigate college admissions. And I can tell you for a fact that Princeton is a bit more expensive today than $96. But you could see even in the letters at that time, that was a lot of money. That was a conversation like, hey, you know, this is how you spent your inheritance. This is, you know, a significant investment, right? And then this is kind of the last letter that I wanted to show from this time period. And I just think it's so, it's such a dad move. So the father is writing to Nathan, and Nathan's about to come home for good, to be done with Princeton. And his father is writing to him, basically giving him instructions on how to return. And he's basically telling him, get down to Point of Rocks. I presume on the train, although I'm not positive of that based on the way he writes it. I'm not even sure if trains were around in 37 or not. But anyway, get down to Point of Rocks. And then from there, you can just walk down the towpath to lock number 27, which is that lock house there. And then the lock keeper can show you how to go, or we might have to send somebody for you. But he even mentions later on the letter, we're gonna be pretty busy in the field, so you might just have to figure it out. And out of curiosity, I was just thinking, like, how far is that? And it's about a 9-mile walk. So it's not insane, but it's, you know, it's a pretty good distance to be coming home from. And it's just, and it's gonna be middle of winter too. And so I like this imagery of, you know, this young Nathan, who at the time he's only like 20 when he finished Princeton, but he's, you know, walking down the towpath back home to Inverness, following, you know, graduation from Princeton in the late 1830s. It's kind of fascinating. Okay, so that's part one. And then now what I want to do, and I won't spend too long on it because I want to give plenty of time for questions if there are any, or discussion. But now what we're going to do is we're going to jump ahead like 10 years, right? Why am I doing this? Basically, what happened was after Nathan graduated from Princeton, he worked in a law firm in Winchester, Virginia for a bit. And then he went up to Yale Law School and he finished there in 1840. And then throughout the 1840s, to be frank, I don't have a whole lot of record. There's not much. There's a couple of letters here and there to him that I have, but they're largely about his law practice. They're not particularly interesting. And they don't really tell us much about the family. And where I think things start to pick up and we start seeing more kind of historical evidence that it is fascinating is in the 1850s. And so let's kind of pretend that we've kind of zoomed down the road to the 1850s now. You know, Nathan is in 1850, he's 33, right? And he has an 8-year-old son by the name of Benjamin. And so we kind of pick up there. And so Benjamin, as he, you know, comes to age and I believe as a teenager, maybe even earlier, they send him, Nathan and his wife send Benjamin, their oldest son, and their only son actually, to Episcopal High School, which is a boarding school in Alexandria, Virginia. School was started in 1839, excuse me. And if you wanted to send your kids or grandchildren there today, you could. It's very much still in operation. They have their own historian who I've talked to. They have records on every student that's graduated from there. So as soon as I brought Benjamin Smith White up, they talked about him as if he had just left yesterday, which was weird and really kind of cool. But they basically passed on to me that, you know, I had, based on some digging, I had figured out that he had been here. And I reached out to the school to say, hey, can you confirm that? And what do you have on him? And they confirmed it. They said, yes, definitely. They didn't actually have a ton of records, but they did have these notes on him, basically kind of taking a leadership role. And we have some account of it from his classmates, where in the late 1850s and even into 1860, as it was becoming clear that, you know, Lincoln had been elected, the Civil War was about to kind of kick off. There were kind of dark clouds forming. And the school was kind of in 1860, I believe, was kind of on the verge of trying to figure out, should we close down, or what should we do here? And basically students started to, at the time, I believe it was all male. They started to kind of just set up their own little kind of, high school age military units and start to drill and practice, because I think, frankly, they all saw it coming. And Benjamin Smith White, Nathan's oldest son, he clearly took a pretty prominent role, kind of leading men around, in drill here at high school. And the second that he was able to enlist into the Confederate Army, he did, right? So he left right away. And one of the things that I think is interesting is he joined Company G of the 2nd Virginia Infantry. And that unit was known as Bott's Grays, and it's named after the individual who was the commander of the group, who was an individual by the name of Lawson Bott. And Lawson Bott was actually Benjamin's father, Nathan, again, his law partner in Charlestown, West Virginia, right? So I don't think that's a coincidence. I suspect there's some conversation that takes place where Lawson says to Nathan, hey, I'm forming this unit. I know your son's interested in getting in the fight. Let him come fight for me, and I can keep an eye on him, right? And I suspect that's something like that took place. No evidence of that, but that's kind of what the records tell us. And so we have, we start picking up on history, artifacts again, where we have these letters from young Benjamin White. And the letters are the ones that we have are from his mother's kind of historical files that were passed down. So these letters are all addressed to his mom's, 4 or 5 letters from around 1861 to this one. And he's talking about, his overall commander is Stonewall Jackson, which is interesting. And so a lot of the letters are just talking about, Stonewall came and gave us this very inspiring speech, or, we're here today, but we're being told we're going to move here tomorrow. And he's very upbeat and kind of very reassuring to his mother that, hey, I'm doing fine. Everything's good. I feel good and healthy. Everyone's in good spirits. And this letter, I think is fascinating. It's written on April 3rd, 1863. And that quote that I pulled there, I just liked, because it's this letter to his mom that is basically saying, winter is ending, spring is coming on, fighting season is coming. And I can tell that we're getting ready to do something, and sure enough, a month later at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Benjamin is killed, right? And he's very much, from my understanding, from accounts I've read, kind of, he's an infantry soldier. He's very much on the front lines. He was not an officer. He wasn't, in some kind of special organization. He's killed on May 3rd of 1863. And if you follow the Civil War, you kind of there's some specific dates around the Civil War that are significant. May 3rd is one of those days, just because so many individuals were killed on May 3rd, because it's the Battle of Chancellorsville, which is, one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. And what I think is, I don't know why I find it interesting. Maybe it's kind of weird, but I do find myself kind of wondering, how did this take place and where? And just because you feel like so much background on this individual and where he came from. And what I've drawn here is kind of the best of my knowledge based on the unit he was in, the action he was involved in. I think it's somewhere around there that he was killed, probably in midday. I don't know that for sure. But obviously, this individual's life cut very short. Believe me when I say I am far from sympathetic to anything related to the Confederacy. I'm very glad that they were crushed. But on a very just kind of human level, and as somebody who has been to Iraq twice, I do have respect for kind of anybody on the battlefield. And so you can imagine that this is quite a crushing blow to his family. I mean, as it would be for any family, right? And so then what we have is his mother's journal. And it stretches from 1863 all the way until the late 1880s. And the first entry is a little more than a month after her son has been killed. But you can see from the way that she's writing that she knows that the troops have come back and they've been gone for some time. She knows that her son is missing. And I don't know if she kind of knows he's been killed and she's trying to kind of ignore that reality, or if she really at that point just doesn't know. And, keep in mind, during the Civil War, I mean, information flow was very, very difficult, right? So you're killed on the battlefield, you're likely just buried right there on the battlefield at that time, and then they'll kind of figure it out later. So, it's quite possible that this, 4, 5, 6 weeks later, she still didn't know this. I'm not sure. But you can see by September 28th, she obviously has been made aware and she understands. And what we have in this journal, which it's pretty sad to read. It's basically, she only has 2 entries every single year for like the next 20 years. One entry every year on May 3rd of whatever the day is, which is the anniversary of her son's death. And the other on September 28th, which is the anniversary of his birthday. And every single year she writes, my only son, Benjamin, today would have been 31, 33, 36. Like, I mean, she continues to go. And it's quite clear from the journal that this is a loss that she never recovered from. I mean, and as a parent, that's completely understandable. But it's fascinating and like I said, very sad actually to see it in writing over and over again. You can't tell from the copies I have. She writes that the pages are drenched in tears, like even 15 years later as she's writing it is, I'm sure. But so, just kind of a very, very, very personal kind of, in-depth look at kind of grief, which obviously is, another one of those things that does not change. And to be honest with you, I was going to end it there, but that feels way too sad to end. So the other kind of the next piece of this is, I just wanted to say that, largely kind of the letters and a lot of those kind of historical records stop at that point. I don't have letters, to Nathan when he's a grandfather or anything. I wish I did. They very well may exist somewhere. But we do have evidence that, life continued to go on, right? He had this very successful law practice that he ran into the 1880s. It was in a building that's like in the dead center of where Charlestown, West Virginia is now. Long before the casinos and horse racing came to town. His daughter, he had 2 children, Benjamin, who was killed, and then his daughter, Rebecca. She married into a very well-to-do family, the Trapnells. And so she ended up having a very comfortable life. They had 6 grandchildren, 3 boys, 3 girls, and they were very heavily involved in the Zion Episcopal Church in Charlestown, which is where they're all buried today. So again, I don't know. I don't want that ending to be like overly sad. I think it's just it's a fascinating kind of look with kind of written documents and letters to see kind of different facets of what life was like back then, in some of the same places that we kind of traverse and travel by every single day now. And that, I think things kind of look different, but for the most part, a lot of these sentiments and concerns have not changed. And with that, I will take any questions.
Hey, Kenny, Dennis Conley here. Why Charlestown, since their ancestral home was Inverness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, I think that kind of falls into that like 1840s time period where there's a little bit of an absence of evidence. There's a bunch of letters where he is talking to his cousins and members of his family about, and they're trying to convince him to go west. Obviously, Charlestown is not really west as I would consider it. But it seemed like he had interest in kind of expanding his horizons a bit beyond, you know, where he grew up. And so for whatever reason, he ended up there. Like I said, he did kind of like it almost seemed like a internship type thing in Winchester. So he was already kind of out in that area. And the other thing is, I'm not totally sure where his wife came from. So I don't know if he met her along the way and she was from those parts or what. But yeah, so not a great answer. I'm not sure. It's something I've been interested in myself.
All right, now would be the time if anyone wants to unmute and ask questions. I do have one question from the chat so far that says, how did you come about getting these letters?
Yeah. So I'll be honest. I don't completely remember how that transpired. I was doing just some significant kind of rabbit hole digging on Google for names related to these individuals. And what I found first was the journal from the mother, who's kind of in that, you know, very long state of grief. Her stuff was relatively easy to find because what happened was, because their daughter married into that Trapnell family, the Trapnells, you know, for whatever reason, were one of those families that kind of preserved everything. So they have just massive records on everything related to their families. And that journal kind of ended up in their holdings. And so that was easy to find. And the letters from her son before he had been killed were kind of, I guess, in her journal. So they got preserved with them. The letters to Nathan that ended up at Duke were, I don't remember. I was just Googling and I found it. And I remember even when Duke sent them to me, I wasn't convinced that it was going to be the right Nathan White, because it just seemed too weird to me that it would end up there. But what I started to find, like as soon as I started reading the first few lines, was that they were talking about the same people. And then at the top of one of the letters, they even referenced the fact that it was being written from Inverness, which was fascinating because I wasn't sure when kind of Inverness got its name, because a lot of these old houses that we know of with certain names weren't necessarily called that when they were first built. But clearly Inverness has had that name since at least the 1830s.
Hey, Kenny, Jack Templeton, how you doing?
Hey, what's going on?
Looking at the letters you scanned, reminded me of a real neat resource, online resource, that you might find handy. In fact, I sent you the link on Facebook Messenger here this evening.
Okay. Great.
But it's Virginia's Chancery court records. And Loudoun County is one of the counties that they've got court records back to, I think it was the 1760s.
Oh, wow.
Scanned it online. And in a quick search of the White family, there's literally dozens of cases that pop up. Huh. Elijah White shows up in about 4 or 5 of the cases over there after the Civil War. So being that it's just a stone's throw away, I even noticed some Titus names popping up. That being as close as it was, Poolesville families could have shown up in court proceedings over there in Leesburg. So might be a resource.
Looking at that, that's a great idea to look at. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that, you know, Elijah White, after they lost the Civil War, he basically decided to live the rest of his life across the river in Loudoun County, and I think he was like a sheriff or like part of the bank, and so it doesn't surprise me that he shows up a lot. But I'll bet you're right that there probably are a lot of other linkages there.
Kenny, I have a question. It's PJ's mom. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Is Inverness still a working farm? Is there a family living there, or and the place is still standing?
Yes, it's very much still there. It's still a working farm. In fact, I think it's one of like the only like certified organic farms in, I don't know, in the area. So I am working very hard to visit Inverness. It's a little bit more of a trickier location to get into. But yeah, it's still there. It's, you know, the home is still very much intact, and it had some really wealthy. Well, I don't know who technically what the financial background person is in now is, but in the, I think 60s and 70s. I think it was the Buchanan family, which was quite wealthy, owned it. And so I know they did a lot of work in kind of upkeep, which I think probably helps ensure that it kind of remained in pretty good condition.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any more questions? All right, thank you so much, Kenny.
Yeah,
thank you, Kenny. Very interesting again, as always.
Great again. Thank you so much.
Glad to be here.
Yeah.